Hello, good day, good morning, good afternoon, depending on what time it is with you. And hello, my name is Adrian Wootton. I'm a long-time friend and the kind of English advisor to Noir and Fest. And this is my virtual contribution this year to Noir and Festival. And I'd like to thank my great friends, Giorgio Gassetti and Marina Fabri, and all the lovely team at Noir and Fest for inviting me once again. I think our association now goes over 3 decades with the festival, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person in Milan, but it's great to be a virtual participant in the festival and talk about 2 of my favorite writers, 2 of my favorite creative figures who actually have a very particular relationship to Noir and Festival. So hello to all of you who are watching online. Hello to everyone who is in watching this, and hello to Giorgio, who I know is introducing this in So let me crack on. This is a masterclass about Graham Greene and John Le Carré, both about them individually as writers and creative artists, but also about the curious acquaintanceship, friendship, and the analogies between their careers and their lives, the similarities and the differences, and the relationship that they had together. And I'm going to present a series of slides and images as I go through this talk. And if I can get this, and there we go. So that's the talk that I'm going to be running through today. And after you've watched this talk, I'm delighted to say I've also had the pleasure of interviewing Richard Greene, the biographer and poet, the Canadian biographer and poet, who's written a new biography of Graham Greene. And we have, as a kind of follow-on from this, a lovely conversation where he shares with me all kinds of interesting insights about his research and helps, I think, embellish what I'm going to say about Graham Greene and John Le Carré. So I hope you'll enjoy this talk and then go on and watch the talk with Richard and myself. I'm going to start by talking about Graham Greene, and then I'm going to come into John Le Carré and how they got to know each other a little bit. Greene always pretty much wanted to be a novelist. He had a kind of an interesting childhood, settled at a public school that his father was the headmaster of. It should have been a kind of normal upper middle class childhood, but it wasn't. He was troubled by depression. Richard Greene talks about this. He had quite a complicated childhood, and the only consistent thing really that Graham Greene loved was literature. He was very much influenced by Robert Louis Stevenson, who he had a distant kind of relationship with, a familial relationship with ancestry of. He was a voracious reader, and reading and writing were early on the one thing that gave him some stability and fixity in his life. And although he enjoyed some early success with his first novel, he came away from Oxford. He converted to Catholicism. Catholicism became very important to him, and I'm sure we'll touch more on Catholicism as I go along. And he wrote his first novel, The Man Within. It was an early success. Then he had 2 terrible flops, and actually, very relevant for Noir and Fest, it was only when he wrote Stamboul Train in 1933 that a thriller, or a shocker, as he called him, that he started to enjoy commercial success. And then as the sort of 30s went on, he also became a film critic. I'll talk about that in a minute. As the 30s went on, he sort of mentally divided his books into entertainments, the thrillers, things like Stamboul Train, things like Gun for Sale, which you can see there, and the more serious novels, even though the distinction is somewhat arbitrary. And Brighton Rock, one of his greatest novels, actually did start life as a entertainment, a shocker, and then sort of became something more serious. So I'm not sure that the distinction is a valid one, and Richard Greene and I talk about that later. I'm also not sure that he wasn't always kind of hanging on to genre and thriller for for plots, for character. It was an underlying part of the framework of his work as a creative artist forever, notwithstanding other things intervening. The other thing that happened with Graham Greene, partly maybe because of his kind of his restlessness, his ability to get bored very easily, his mental health problems, he became a relentless traveler. And in fact, his books became more and more and more about where he visited and the different places. It was like he became a tourist in empire, a tourist in the British Empire, a tourist in the European empires that were beginning to collapse, and the emerging empires of America. And that provided the wellspring for much of his most creative work as he went through the 1930s, 40s, 50s. But also, of course, he did experience World War II. This is, more books that the notable books that he wrote, and he became a film critic. Cinema was very important to Graham Greene. If I say that travel was incredibly important to Graham Greene, his religion, his conversion to Catholicism, so he could get married to his wife Vivian, was incredibly important to him. He was often described and was very irritated by being described as the English Catholic novelist. But cinema was very important. He saw cinema for a very young age at the Rex Cinema in Berkhamsted, where he grew up, where his father's school was, where he went to school. And he said that he didn't write with the eye of a painter. His descriptions were through the eye of a cine camera. It was incredibly important to him how cinema worked on his imagination. And he also became a really acerbic and quite nasty film critic, attacking actually films of people that actually became very good friends of his, like Alexander Korda, who actually employed him as a screenwriter in the 1930s and gave him his kind of apprenticeship. His kind of film criticism came to a nasty end, though, because of this incident where he wrote a rather nasty review of this particular film, Wee Willie Winkie, and suggested that Shirley Temple was being watched for reasons other than her family kind of cuteness, and was being and that people were watching it for more lascivious reasons. There was a big court case. There was a big fine. The magazine that he wrote the review for got closed down, and actually Greene fled the country to escape the ignominy of it, and it took him ages and ages to pay back the personal fine that he got levied for having written the review and caused aspersions on Warner Brothers. So he, being a film critic, actually got Graham Greene in trouble with the law. But his interest in cinema didn't go away, and his interest in writing for the cinema. He also had his work adapted by American cinema. And actually, one of the important things to stress, again, relating to Ironfest, is that although Graham Greene didn't like the American cinema versions of his work, they were adapted during the classic period of film noir. And just in the same way as Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and James M. Cain's works fueled the film noir kind of boom of the 1940s and 50s, Graham Greene was the English novelist, along with Eric Ambler to a certain extent, was the English novelist who fueled film noir in America. And so he made a very important contribution to the development of American cinema, even though it was a cinema he didn't like, and even though he didn't like these films. I think he's wrong, by the way, about these films. That things like Ministry of Fear by Fritz Lang and Gun for Hire, I think, are terrific film noir movies, and Greene actually, I think, misjudged them. And here's the sort of notable examples of that period. What he did like about them was the money, which gave him more financial independence and allowed him to pursue his desire to travel more. The interesting thing also about the wartime was that Greene wanted to be, which most of these adaptations were made, Greene wanted to be in the war in some senses. He wasn't really cut out to be a soldier. He kind of he wasn't the right physique. I know he was quite resilient, and actually the different places he went in his career would have killed lots of other people in terms of the climate, in terms of the diseases, but he actually had a very strong constitution. But he wasn't really cut out to be a soldier. But through his sister, actually, he kept on inquiring about, well, couldn't he be in the Secret Service? Couldn't he be a spy in the war? And through a variety of different things that happened, he actually got his wish. He was interviewed, he did some basic training, and then he was posted off to West Africa, where he became part of the espionage activities of the British military, was in Sierra Leone. That's where he first met the senior and very clever spy master Kim Philby, and had various adventures. I think it's fair to say that whilst he sort of was managing a spy ring and was involved in material which he would then reuse some years later in Our Man in Havana, his famous comic spy novel, which was made into a film, of course, with Carol Reed starring Alec Guinness. He wasn't very good at it. He wasn't really cut out to be a spy in that way, and it was a relatively short period. He was out there for literally, I think, 2.5 years, and then he ended up coming back in London. But it did give him a lot of insider knowledge of the spy world and insider knowledge of the people who were really clever spies. Of course, Kim Philby was later unmasked as the greatest spy traitor, giving secrets, giving agents, giving British spy rings to the Russians right the way through the Cold War period. And we have, no knowledge that Greene was aware of this at all when he was working with him. But very bizarrely, and this is important when we talk about John Le Carré in a minute, very bizarrely, he developed a friendship with Philby that lasted through his unmasking as a massive traitor who got many, many, many British agents killed. And this was a point of conflict, a very big point of conflict with Greene and other people, but particularly with John Le Carré. But we'll come back to that. The other thing that happened, Greene went back to London. He wrote one of his greatest books, which is set in wartime, The End of the Affair. And he picked up, as the war ended, the kind of the threads of his screenwriting career. He went to work for the Bolting brothers. He wrote the treatment and screenplay for the brilliant adaptation of his own novel, Brighton Rock, which is a kind of film noir with a Catholic kind of structure to it. Somebody once said to me, in fact, Iris Murdoch once said to me, and we talk about this, Richard Greene and I, that would Greene have been a better novelist if he hadn't have been a Catholic? I think it's almost impossible to talk about that now. It certainly makes it more difficult sometimes to read his work, not so much the movies, but the novels, because there's a whole architecture, there's a whole thematic structure of faith, belief, damnation, redemption that we find much more difficult to recognize today. But it's also what makes the novel so compelling and what makes him actually even more of a noir novelist, whether he's using genre or whether he's not using genre. Anyway, Brighton Rock obviously was a big success in the UK at least. And he then formed a collaboration with his friend Alex Corder, the producer Alex Corder. He made a film called Fallen Idol, again another adaptation from one of his own short stories, which was a huge success, and formed this lifelong friendship with the brilliant director Carol Reed. And then, of course, in 1949, they made The Third Man. And this, if Graham Greene's influence and importance on noir, as we look back, and I should have said this before, is because this is 30 years after his death, and just over 30 years since he became the first recipient of the Raymond Chandler Award at Noir Infest back in 1990, is that Graham Greene influenced the crime fiction genre because of his entertainments. Entertainments paved the way for his success. He influenced the noir genre on film, first of all, because his works were adapted for American cinema. And then thirdly, he created the first real European noir movie in The Third Man, using real life locations, the Vienna, the divided Vienna in the immediate post-war, the drug trafficking, unscrupulous criminal gangsters were flogging to people. And he puts it into a pulp fiction setting. That's what makes it a masterpiece. That's why Graham Greene had such an abiding effect on and influence on the noir genre. And interestingly, it's all of those elements that what made him so interesting to John Le Carré. Now, John Le Carré, very different. I mean, they're both Englishmen. They both went to public school. So they share a certain class linkage. But obviously, Le Carré a lot younger, born in 1930, and still very different backgrounds. Greene, obviously, a childhood trauma, depression, but comfortable, middle class, reliable, educated background. Le Carré, father a criminal, an imposter, a confidence trickster who was in and out of jail, in and out of money, embroiled Le Carré as a young man in his schemes, and in fact led to the breakup of his marriage. And Le Carré didn't then see his mother for something like 25 years. And Le Carré rushed to escape, as David Cornwell, that's his real name. Le Carré rushed to escape his father's schemes, his father's lies, his father's all his father's crimes, really, and that led him to not only flee his family, he fled the country, and through a combination of circumstances at university, he was introduced to the world of the spy. And first off, he enrolled in MI5, the sort of domestic branch of the Secret Service, looking for spies from within the UK. He didn't like that very much. He didn't get on very well in MI5, and soon graduated to MI6, the international service. Looking at spies elsewhere, looking at spy rings, running agents. And this was when he started doing this in the 1950s. This is the height of the Cold War. The East Germany, West Germany, Russia, the UK, US were embroiled in this horrendous, violent, dangerous, nasty process of spying. I'm not saying it's gone and it's all over now, but this was the absolute epicenter. And although Le Carré spent most of his life as an adult saying, "Oh, I was only a minor official. I didn't really do anything. It wasn't terribly important," that was all nonsense. And he admitted later, much later in fact, really only towards the end of his life, when it was talked about more in the very good biography of him by Adam Susskind, and he gave some interviews actually really near at the end of his life, where he admitted much more about his life as a spy. He's a pretty good spy, but he was interested in literature. He was interested in literature from an early age, just like Greene. He actually was massively influenced by Greene. He loved Greene's work, was very, very, very passionate about it. I think he even wrote him kind of early fan letters to Greene, saying, and he was famously quoted saying that Greene had more or less single-handedly carried the torch of English literature through the 1940s and 50s. That's some claim. And some people, I mean, John Manville, the most recent recipient of the Noir and Fest Raymond Chandler Award, wouldn't necessarily agree with that stature, but it's certainly one I agree with. It's certainly one that Richard Greene agrees with. And Le Carré loved Greene's work, and it had a profound lifelong influence on him and his writing. But he started writing whilst he was a spy. I don't know that he was going to give up being a spy and turn full-time to writing. He certainly couldn't afford to initially when he wrote his first book, A Murder of Quality. But suddenly he had no choice. He had no choice because whilst he was actually very successful and very clever espionage agent for MI6, his cover was blown. And it was blown by none other than Kim Philby. Yes, Kim Philby, a colleague, associate, friend of Graham Greene. And so actually from pretty early on, John Le Carré, aka David Cornwall, hated Kim Philby because of the betrayal of him personally. He had personal skin in the game, but also he hated him because he got lots of his friends and colleagues killed. All these Philby's actions meant lots and lots of agents were captured by the East German intelligence, by Russian intelligence, tortured and murdered. And that was down on Philby's head. And Le Carré, as a faithful patriot and believer in the Cold War and believing in what Britain was doing in that, could not forgive Philby for any of his actions. But the one thing that it did do is that it forced him, his cover was blown, he couldn't carry on being a real life spy. So he used all the incredible intelligence, and he had much more deep intelligence than Greene. I mean, Greene gained a lot of things for, things like Amen and Havana, but Le Carré was there and bought the ticket. He really knew the intelligence service inside out, the personalities, the methodologies that were being used all over the world. He knew it with granular, precise detail, and he employed that. And he employed that particularly in Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And this is where Graham Greene comes back in. Spy Who Came In From the Cold was Le Carré's breakout, huge success, his first post-spy novel, if you see what I mean. And actually, Graham Greene wrote an amazing review, which was published and used as a blurb promotion on the back of the book, and has stayed in the UK and in English versions of the book on forever, where Greene talks about this being one of the greatest spy novels ever written. And of course it is. And this was financially very rewarding for Le Carré, and he was set fair to become the greatest espionage writer of his generation, which is why also back in 2001, because it's obviously this is a year since John Le Carré, David Cornwall, passed away. It's also 10 years, it's nearly 20 years since he was presented with the noir-infest Raymond Chandler Award in 2002. So Graham Greene got it, the very first one, and then in 1990, and then John Le Carré got it, and we had the great pleasure of meeting him in 2001. Greene's reaction to Spy Who Came From the Cold, and Le Carré writing to thank him, was the start of their curious acquaintanceship. It was their acquaintanceship made in the 1960s, really, was in the latter part of Greene's career. I mean, he lived another 30 years, but it was still in the second phase of Greene's career when he met Le Carré, and he carried on being a prolific novelist. He became more and more famous. He became monikered as the most famous novelist not to win the Nobel Prize. So Greene was becoming a kind of grand old man of letters and literature, as John Le Carré was starting his ascent as the young Turk of espionage and spy writing. Their acquaintanceship properly began, though, post The Spy Who Came In From the Cold being published. It just so happened that Le Carré was living in Austria with his family for tax reasons. He was working on a new book, and Greene was going to come visiting Austria and asked to meet Le Carré. And then they went out with, I think it was Le Carré's agent. They had dinner together. This is documented by Richard Greene. They had dinner together, and it was in March 1964, and got quite drunk together and had a very pleasant evening, swapping compliments about each other's work and gossiping. There was a moment as well. Greene asked Le Carré, had he been a real spy, and he completely and utterly denied it, which is characteristic of of David Cornwell through, as I said, through his whole life. This is what he said to me on stage. This is what he said at Warren Fester. And he kept up with that fiction for many, many years. But anyway, they met, they got on pretty well. And then literally a month later, Le Carré had reason to be in Paris because he had to go there for work reasons. And at that time, Greene was living in Paris. He had a flat in Paris. And so he was invited to have a second meeting with Greene. And again, he went round to his flat. They passed a pleasant time together. And, you know, the beginnings of a sort of not deep friendship, but a mutual admiration, acquaintanceship started. But almost as soon as it had begun, not almost as soon as it had begun, but an acquaintanceship that was sort of back and forth over a couple of years, let's say 64 to 66, 67, was shattered almost irrevocably, because obviously Philby had been revealed as a traitor, had defected, and as I said, John Le Carré was very, very angry about this, whereas Graham Greene actually didn't feel as strongly at all. And then this book came out, and it was a book it was the first book written about the whole Philby scandal and what had happened to British intelligence because of Philby, and how it had destroyed British intelligence in many ways, provided the basis actually for Le Carré's, in some way, it definitely inspired the famous Smiley trilogy, which I'll come back to. And this book came out, which was a sort of documentary, not exactly a biography, but a look back at Philby's career. And Le Carré wrote an article, which then the publishers asked, could they use the article as an introduction to the book? And the article was a very damning article about Philby. Greene got the book to review it for a newspaper, and not only attacked the book, but attacked Le Carré for his position on Philby. And so they had this literary, through the newspapers, falling out, where basically Le Carré said it was absolutely outrageous that Greene in any way could justify any of Philby's traitorous actions, and vice versa. Graham Greene could not accept the vehemence and anger that Le Carré felt about Philby. And basically that was it. 1968, smashed. End of this fledgling love-in relationship. Until, and actually this was instigated by Le Carré, not by Greene. Le Carré started to travel for research for his books. Before, he'd said he'd very much researched them from the desk. There were places he'd been, but there were also places that he felt he'd made mistakes in the writing of certain novels because he hadn't been to them. Well, obviously, he knew the modus operandi of Graham Greene, which was to go places, to write journalism, to come up with books. That's how things like The Quiet American was written, how, you know, The Comedians was written, how and actually Le Carré loved The Comedians, for example, in 1967. He wrote this was before the Philby break. He wrote a rave review of it, said that the critics had been cruel about it. And he loved that idea that Greene would wander the globe, going to kind of incredibly dangerous, war-torn places, you know, Haiti being one of them for The Comedians, or Vietnam for the young American, for The Quiet American, or, you know, numerable Mexico, Power and Glory, going back into the 1940s. He loved that idea. And what's interesting is that even though he was not on speaking terms, as they were at late 60s, early 70s, with Graham Greene, Le Carré began to adopt his modus operandi of work. And that led to the renewal of their acquaintanceship. Tentative, fragile, but the renewal. This, of course, are arguably the greatest books of Le Carré's career. Certainly the first, the Smiley trilogy, Tickettella Soldier by the Honourable Schoolboy and Smiley's People. And actually, it was when writing and researching these and travelling to different places that Greene had been, he then, in 1974, wrote again to Greene and kind of said, "Oh, I'm sorry that we fell out, and I hope that that spat over Philby hasn't damaged your view of me." And Greene wrote back a really nice, generous letter, and their correspondence kind of resumed. It was infrequent. I'm not aware that they met again face to face, but they certainly did keep on exchanging letters. And what's interesting was that it's these books, and from the 70s onwards, that if you look at Le Carré's travels, they're not all to the same place as Greene, but he goes to a number of the same places, and he does adopt that modus operandi, except that Greene would often go completely alone. Le Carré would find someone in the particular country who had particular knowledge. It could be a journalist, could be an ex-military person, and he would team up with them to get guided round. But he put himself in harm's way in the same way that Graham Greene put himself in harm's way by the climate, the disease, the unstable situation. He would put himself into war zones, and it would provide him with his inspiration, and inspiration that spurred on the brilliant novels of the 1970s and the 1980s, and allowed him actually to carry on when the Cold War started to get run out of steam, and perestroika happened, and all of a sudden the framework, the ecosystem that Le Carré had been mining for 20 odd years started to erode. He could move on to the global concerns, global cultural concerns that weren't necessarily so rooted in espionage, because he'd adopted that modus operandi of travel and exploration and putting himself in harm's way. The other interesting thing about that renewed acquaintance is that, and I think every critic would accept this, is that Graham Greene was highly regarded and revered, but his books weren't bestsellers in the same way as Le Carré's were in the 1970s. He didn't have the same popularity. He was this grand old man of letters in that sense, sort of living in the south of France. And he then wrote a spy novel. And the spy novel, The Human Factor, which came out in 1978, more or less just after the Smiley novels had become a huge sensation in all over the world for Le Carré. And he wrote a novel about British intelligence, a novel that was made into a not very good film, it has to be said, starring Richard Attenborough. And I had the pleasure of talking to Richard Attenborough about Graham Greene, and his love of Graham Greene, his friendship with Graham Greene. We talked a lot about how he used to have lunches with Graham Greene and try and avoid talking about the bad films, including this one, and only talk about the ones that Greene liked, like Brighton Rock, because Richard Attenborough was in 3 films: the film version of Man Within, film version of Brighton Rock, and The Human Factor, and they'd always pass over the ones that he knew Greene hated, and frankly he was embarrassed by. But the interesting thing about this spy novel is, if you read it, it's so influenced by Le Carré. It uses his world, his milieu. In fact, it's quite un-Greene-like. And it seems to me that it's not a stretch, it's not an exaggeration to say that he really was channeling John Le Carré, channeling him for inspiration, channeling him for context, and perhaps channeling him for commercial success. And boy, it worked. This was one of the most commercially successful novels of the latter part of Graham Greene's career. The interesting thing is that some years later, when Le Carré was trying to do a kind of comic, exotically set Panama set, another location that Greene had also visited, he channels Greene, because if Greene had success with Our Man in Havana, both the book in the late 50s and the film version, again starring Alec Guinness, that's another mutual acquaintance. Both Greene and Le Carré were friends of Guinness. They both had him star in versions of their own work. So that's the other interesting connection. There's a connection about travel. There's a connection about spying. There's a connection about writing. and there's a connection about friendship, and that other friendship was Alec Guinness. And Greene talked very warmly about Guinness and worked with him very closely on things like Our Man in Havana, and he was also in The Comedians. But Le Carré became a very close friend of Greene's, and close friend of Guinness's, and he came and talked with me on stage about Greene and Guinness at a retrospective we staged at the National Film Theatre in London on Alec Guinness, and he shared his kind of anecdotes of his friendship with Guinness. So there are a lot of interesting interlinked connections between the two of them. And there's the evidence. There's the evidence from my dear colleagues at Noir and Fest in 2001 on stage, where John Le Carré, David Cornwell was holding up the Brasher doubloon, and I remember that with a great deal of affection. And then the year afterwards in London on stage, talking to me about Graham Greene, Alec Guinness, and not being a spy. So there's the sort of documentary evidence of that. I mean, the interesting thing is, I think that Le Carré, Graham Greene became this sort of benevolent man of letters in his later years and traveled the world saying kind of quite outlandish things at different conventions, etc. Le Carré became more outspoken. He became an angry old man. He became much more politicized. And that's what I think made him even more interesting. With books like, as he moved away from the conventional spy story that had made his name and reputation, and with novels like The Constant Gardener, he wanted to take on pharmaceutical companies. He wanted to expose the evils that were going on, whether it was in the Middle East or Africa. And he did that very, very consciously and knowingly. He was never frightened of making enemies. I mean, in fact, the Secret Service kind of hated him because they felt he'd exposed too much of them. The real life characters, Maurice Oldfield, who was the head of MI6 and was the model for Alec Guinness in the television version of the Smiley series, actually went to lunch with Le Carré and the head of that, Maurice Oldfield, and looked at his behaviour and borrowed his behaviour. It's interesting that years later, in the remake of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Gary Oldman went to lunch with John Le Carré and borrowed mannerisms from Le Carré to actually be George Smiley. So it's interesting that Guinness borrows from a spy master, Oldfield borrows from Le Carré, and I think Le Carré's books sustain themselves brilliantly. He did return to espionage, but they sustain themselves brilliantly. He became an even more rounded, outspoken, and brilliant writer, I think. The other interesting thing he did with his sons was he formed a production company and really took hold and control of the movies made from his work. And I think that's what led to the quality and brilliance of them that kind of came out. The fact that we got the fantastic film version of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the fantastic film version of The Night Manager, I think was because he took the control back into his own hands of how those adaptations would be realized. And I think that was a really clever and very sensible thing for him to do. And here's some slides of some of those adaptations coming literally right up to date. And here's the last books of Le Carré. As I say, very prolific right up until, the novel that was released that had sat in a desk drawer, Silverview, which I had the pleasure of reading just a week or two ago, and is a lovely little novella to kind of a coda to Le Carré's career. And there are the obituaries of Le Carré's career. So that's been quite a canter through. Quite a canter through two very long and very, very different careers of Le Carré, of Greene, and I'm going backwards very quickly so you can just see again some of those points I've been trying to make, but to conclude, to end, before you get the chance to see this terrific conversation I managed to have with Richard Greene, the novelist, the biographer of Graham Greene, is that they were very different men from different eras. Class, education, language connected them. A love of literature connected them. A mutual love of each other's work connected them. They were divided by religion. They were divided by politics. One a Catholic, one vehemently an atheist, not a Catholic, not a religious man in John Le Carré. One a real spy and a successful spy who spent most of his life concealing the fact that he'd been a successful spy, who was blown by Kilphilby. One who worked with Kilphilby, who wasn't a very good spy and still maintained his friendship. In fact, there's the last thing I should say. The last sort of weird encounter that they didn't have together was that Graham Greene visited Russia and visited Kim Philby. And there was even a photograph of the two of them together in Philby's apartment in his defection home in Russia. Le Carré was invited to Russia. He went to Russia and was offered to meet Kim Philby, and he refused. And that was the dividing line between the two of them. It was the acquaintanceship that was wrecked by Kim Philby. It was and it was actually then travel and the pursuit of more and more complex and exotic locales for his work that led him to renew his acquaintance. Our Man in Havana mined the spy world that Greene had inhabited. Spy Who Came In From the Cold and subsequent novels mined the much richer, detailed knowledge of espionage that Le Carré had lived. But they loved each other's work. They fell out over spies and then renewed their contact together. And Graham Greene wrote essentially a homage to John Le Carré with the human factor, and John Le Carré with the Tailor of Panama essentially remakes Our Man in Havana as his homage to Greene. So you have, as I said, literature, travel, spying, and a mutual exchange of ideas and travel. It's a very, very strange and enchanting story about two of the greatest British novelists that have ever lived, and one that, for me, enriches and deepens an understanding of their respective works, even if it's only a thread, a tiny thread that connects them. It's a thread that spread out and had an impact on both their lives and both their works. Thank you very much. This is a particular special event that is celebrating the legacy of Graham Greene, the relationship between Graham Greene and John Le Carré, especially because Graham Greene has a long history of association with Noir and Fest, because he was the first recipient of the Raymond Chandler Award, the most important prize from Noir and Fest, and actually the Graham Greene estate, which owns the Raymond Chandler estate, actually gave permission for the prize to be created in the first place. So there's a lovely connection there. And I'm really delighted that we have a special guest from Toronto in Canada joining us today, the distinguished academic, poet, and biographer, Professor Richard Greene, who's had a long association interpreting and talking about, writing about the work of Graham Greene. He authored, edited this rather wonderful book in terms of Graham Greene, A Life in Letters, an incredibly important resource for anyone interested in Graham Greene back in 2007. And now, very recently, he's produced this rather wonderful new biography about Graham Greene, which has two titles, I believe. This one and actually is also called Russian Roulette as well in the UK, looking at the whole of Graham Greene's life. And it's my great pleasure to talk to him about his study of Graham Greene. So welcome, Richard. It's really a great pleasure to have you as part of Noir and Festival and have the opportunity to chat to you about your work on Graham Greene.
Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and this is a fun, smart festival, and I'm just really grateful to be associated with it.
Well, that's great. Well, let's kick off, because I wanted to sort of go back to the beginning, really, before we get into the meat of the biography. Where did your interest in Graham Greene come from? Did you read him from a very young age, or was this something that you developed when you were studying at school or at university? Why were you interested in Graham Greene in the first place?
I began reading him when I was about 15. I think the first thing I read was the Heart of the Matter, and I didn't like it. But fairly soon, I was hooked on the Power and the Glory and other of his works, and became I don't know, hooked on him over many years, and quite late in the day, my research interests veered towards him. And of course, the obvious questions about the last name. It's a very common last name for people in the English world. And so it's like two people named Smith or Brown. It's so common. So that's a total accident. I have no relation to him, but a fascination.
And that fascination articulated itself, as I just mentioned, in the first instance of a major, because obviously you've written about poets like Edith Sitwell. You are a poet, but you had the opportunity to do something with the letters, which I think really brought to light fresh material that we just weren't familiar with before.
Yes, that was very fortunate. What happened there was I needed some help from Graham Greene's estate over a book I was writing on the poet Edith Sitwell, and a connection sprang up between myself and Graham Greene's son, who was the literary executor. And he had in mind that a book of letters was called for. And when we got into it, we discovered there was all sorts of untapped material, things that had never really come to light. It's a common enough thing, someone finds a box of letters in the attic and gives it to an archive. But that process had been going on, and there was enough there to make what we hoped was a distinctive book. And after a few years, it came out. I very much enjoyed working on that book.
And was that the wellspring for why you thought there was space for a new, for want of a better phrase, literary biography of Greene? Because obviously there has been, I mean, yours is the first one in a long time, it has to be said, but there was a kind of a number of biographies, most famously in a way the voluminous and long running Norman Sherry book, where and I met Mr. Sherry some years ago, and I've seen him almost like a Billy Graham evangelist preacher talking about Greene in various contexts. And he kind of nearly killed himself traveling around the world, going to every place that Graham Greene visited. I think Graham Greene even said, he thought his biographer might not outlive him because of the amount of illnesses he got doing. And yours is a very, very consciously different kind of book. It's not a globe-trotting Trace Greene book. It's a book about his literary development. It obviously is about his life. But were you very conscious that from the letters that you had enough material to do something distinctive?
The letters was certainly the springboard. At the last volume of the Sherry series came out in 2004, but had been written sometime before, a very long editing process. And so that by the time the Book of Letters came out, really the better part of a decade had passed, right, with people and literary estates handing over their papers to archives. So, we just found that there was an awful lot of stuff. With regard to the existing biographies, I wouldn't actually have written this book. I wouldn't give that many years of my life to a project if it was unnecessary, because there's other things you can do, right? Yeah. And there was a difficulty about the final volume of the 3-volume Sherry set, that he was really ill when he did it. And I didn't know this. I wrote a couple of really negative reviews at the time. I would not have written them now if I had known the context. He was, according to his research assistant, he was suffering from Alzheimer's, and in the sorrow of all that, hitting the bottle. And so the project very much fell apart, and so it was very hard to rescue. I undertook to write a new biography, which would be different. It was a single volume biography, and it meant to basically to really emphasize some of the narrative elements, to try to create a book that hung together. Right. And in the writing of it, other things happened. I found that it required me to think about his political involvements a lot, and his travels to troubled places, as opposed to a slightly different technique, which would be, as they say, following in his footsteps and meeting the people he met, which is fine. That's good. A certain amount of that's great. But when you're going into a place where there's a war going on, it's almost more important to read the newspapers than to go around and shake the hands. And find out why there was a war, what was going on, who was being hurt by this, why was he there? And so the political element of my book became more important, as in the writing, actually. One of the things that slowed me down is I thought I had everything in the can about 4 or 5 years before it came out, just thinking, I just have to write this up. But in the writing, I kept running into these questions that sent me back to the library. Just to give an example, Paraguay, an amazing country, but I know nothing about. All I knew about Paraguay was I had read Greene's novel, The Honorary Consul, and I had seen The Mission, the movie. Yes. That is all I knew about Paraguay. So I had to go research it. And there are many countries like that. What did I know about, the Congo? Not enough. And so I had to spend a good deal of time overcoming the limitations of my knowledge to a degree. That was a hugely interesting aspect of the work, but time consuming.
And in terms of, because one of the things that I think is really interesting about the book and that narrative drive it has is that you do trace, I think, in terms of from the beginning, the famous, his slightly odd childhood in Berkhamsted and his the Russian roulette, whether it was Russian roulette, whether it wasn't, whether he was really trying to kill himself. But you do kind of suggest that he probably was bipolar, was, serious depressive, and that and, allied to a sense of permanent kind of escape from boredom meant that created that constant hunger to never be in one place, to constantly travel and then write about, in some senses, whether it was in a more realistic, travel way, or or journalism, or whether it was a fictionalized version of his environment, that was driven by that deep psychological complexity and problems that he had psychologically that led him to never want to stay in one place for any length of time at all.
Yes, absolutely. This is an interesting point, what to do with the issue of his psychiatric record. That as a boy, he was suicidal. He made some attempts. Whether or not there was a bullet in the gun, I don't know. But he played at Russian roulette, which is a fairly serious. If there wasn't a bullet in the gun, there was still a very serious statement for a young person to be toying with a gun like that. And during his life, he often spoke of committing suicide, and his friends expected him to do it. In the 50s, he did finally get into the hands of a proper psychiatrist who had his hands full with this amazing man who, on the one hand, could be very angry, explosive, drank far too much, lots of drugs, and any number of passing relationships with women, and unable to sit still. Destroyed his marriage with his inability to sit still, or indeed to rest in a single relationship with his wife, running off to brothels and God knows what. And so that created a level of frenzy in his life. But one of the things that worries me is that there is a danger saying he did this because of his bipolar illness. And in the book, I generally opt for the phrase "was consistent with" his illness, because I can't say absolutely that he got angry with someone excessively because of his bipolar illness, but it would be consistent with it, irritability being one of the features. He never did get, as far as I know, medication for it. Right. When he was diagnosed, the lithium treatment was coming into use, I believe in Iceland or something. I spoke to a few psychiatrists, and they provided some context. None of them thought it was really a serious proposition to overturn the diagnosis that he received in the 50s, because it fits with what we know about him. And alas, we don't have a file. We don't have a medical file on him.
But in terms of going back to the work in this context, I mean, it seems to me that considering how extraordinary, as you said, frenzied his life could be, the one thing that seemed to be the moment of stability, the iron discipline, the only place there was kind of iron discipline, was the kind of getting up and writing every day, no matter what, no matter where, and the one moment of calm and in a sense, that oasis of calm within everything else that might be going on, no matter where he was in the world.
Actually, I think that's quite about the best way I've ever heard it described. You should, if you have a moment, write that down afterwards. But it's true that he often said that he didn't know how people who didn't write, who didn't pursue an art, could survive the panic of life. And and so that for him, it was really a place that brought some order to each day. He was very committed to it every day. For years, he said 500 words. In the early days, much more than 500 words. Later in life, less, as his stamina declined. And I think that having a satisfying work, even as he was never sure of the quality of what he was doing until the work was done, and even then he wasn't sure. I think that gave him a kind of an ability to go on as other things failed in his life. And in later years, it's interesting, just to add on to that, when he had some writer's block, that was a profound desolation for him, that if he couldn't get down to doing his writing, something fundamental was taken away from him. His well-being was diminished. Yeah. So the writing was the anchor in his life.
And in terms of the writing and in terms of the books, I wanted to just, because obviously this is a noir festival, and actually the interesting thing is some of Graham Greene's life reads like a noir novel, Russian roulette as a child, etc. But in terms of the books itself, I mean, obviously you document this and describe it very eloquently in the book about how essentially he has that sort of full start, with The Man Within, and then he writes some books which are spectacularly unsuccessful. And it's actually only when he writes, in his terms, a shocker or a thriller in terms of Stamboul Train, that suddenly he starts to make some money, and then he gets interest from the movies, etc. And it's what he characterized for some years as the entertainments that are the wellspring of his commercial success or commercial stability. And then we get this slightly strange thing between what's entertainment and what's a serious novel. And Brighton Rock, as you say, started off as a detective story, and then it's then classified as a serious novel, even though I think it was, when it was published first in America, it was actually branded an entertainment. Do you recognize the distinction between the entertainments and the serious work? Do you think it's a real distinction? And if you do you think the entertainments are lesser novels? Because I have a lot of admiration for things like The Ministry of Fear and This Gun for Hire, as well as Brighton Rock or Power and the Glory or End of the Affair.
Yeah, actually, I really think that the two categories collapse almost as soon as he established them. I think late 30s, he started thinking in those terms. and then he, in the early 40s, he writes The Ministry of Fear, which is an immensely sophisticated book. You have spies everywhere, German spies, but there's this line in it about I'm going to totally misquote that you have to apply the psychotherapy to history. And once he gets into this, that's strange. One of the police officers is described as a surrealist, and it's a study of loyalty, of pity, of deception in love. It's an amazing book, and if he hadn't written the famous novels, and that alone was there, I think it would be much more highly regarded. It's a very strange, fascinating, sophisticated book, and undertaken as an entertainment, but it just blossomed in richness and complexity. And I'm with you on that one. And the others are often very striking. You know, you mentioned some from the 30s. Just go forward to The Third Man, and you know, like what a complex work. You know, if you think of Ali Diwali saying he was just Harry, and of course, how are we to apprehend, you know, the life and the value and the essence of a person? And you know, we have Calloway pursuing details like a logical positivist, and then we have this cowboy writer on the other side who's pursuing it as kind of romance. And we have all this Catholic symbolism going on in there. You know, we have a talk about heresies, and anyway, an immensely complex work. And it, of course, is absorbing a huge amount of post-war politics and military situations. So it's very well observed. And so I'm in awe of what goes on in some of these books categorized as entertainment. He himself gave up on the distinction in the 60s. And I think that once you get into Our Man in Havana and then on into Travels with My Aunt, it's really not sustainable because he's writing comedy, but it's very smart comedy.
And he's using those elements as you describe. He's using elements of genre and elements of suspense and what, you know, to a kind of wider purpose in that sense is that they can't be reduced into being genre fiction, but they definitely employ genre fiction in the way you describe.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, you know, you think of just a late novel like The Honorary Consul, a kidnapping.
Yes.
It's at the heart of it. I mean, you know, like there's a good noirish start. We kidnap someone, but then the ironist gets involved and we kidnap the wrong man. And so ridiculous human things start happening in a tragic context. You have soldiers surrounding a cabin. We have a defrocked priest or a laicized priest, whatever that man is, you know, talking about evolution. And we have the political and military situation of Argentina and Paraguay being worked out. It's so complex, and yet at the heart, it's a story about a strange kidnapping, and that's so, for want of a better word, wonderfully noirish.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that's a wonderful description of it. I mean, you mentioned obviously just then Catholic symbolism, and I remember, you know, it's interesting to me because obviously you document, you talk about his conversion, you talk about that ambivalent and complicated relationship he had with Catholicism his whole life, and how he hated that tag of being the Catholic novelist. But I once had a very brief meeting. I was once introduced to Iris Murdoch, who said, because I was on a panel about Graham Greene and the cinema, and she said to me, "Oh, you're interested in Graham Greene?" And I said, "Yes, very, very much so." And she said, "Don't you think he'd have been a better writer if he wasn't Catholic?" And I didn't kind of know what to say to the great Iris Murdoch, apart from that's a very interesting perspective, Miss Murdoch. And then I'll say, but in terms of Catholicism, because you do describe it very clearly in the book, do you think that because certainly some people feel that actually that's an impediment to accessing his work now? How do you feel about that in terms of the Catholicism that is writ large throughout all his work, not just his most famous work?
Yes. That's actually quite an interesting question in terms of the way the readership has changed, that you can't necessarily count on either a sympathy or even a knowledge of some of the troubles of why say troubles? Let me step at some of the dramas, because for Greene, at times the struggle of terrible sin and the maybe possibility of grace offers him a drama that works out in a number of his books. And so it's possible that will be lost on another generation. It's also possible to be lost on another generation of Catholics. If you stop and think that he is a pre-Vatican II convert, and after Vatican II, there's far less discussion of mortal sin, damnation, all those things. I mean, someone will be talking about it. There's doubtless some bishop in Kansas talking about it, but actually there certainly is. But the mindset of even Catholics has moved in another direction. Having said that, some of his later works are impossible to comprehend outside of another aspect of Catholicism, in that when he turns his eye to Latin America, it's pretty much impossible to read his works without considering the sort of more socially oriented kind of Catholicism at work in the background of places like Argentina, Paraguay, Panama, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and so the liberation theologians are there. I would also say that certain aspects of his work, which I just glance on, and I'm not fully sure I understand it yet, were influenced by the evolutionary theology of Teilhard de Chardin.
Yes, and you mentioned that. Yes.
I'm just beginning to wrap my mind around that there's something else going on there. I guess pretty much every author is lost to the future to a certain degree. If you just think that if you read a play by Shakespeare, your eye always goes to the footnotes. And that's just the natural fate of books in time. I guess my larger worry is, will people be reading books at all? Will literature itself become a kind of a thing of the past? I hope not. I hope
so do I.
I don't know. I'm being gloomy here. I shouldn't have said that.
But I want to come back to legacy and Graham Greene in a minute. But before I do, there's a couple of other questions I wanted to ask, because we'll run out of time. There's so many things I'd like to talk to you about. But I want to just go back and ask you, first of all, about the cinema. You've talked already very well about The Third Man, but in terms of, he obviously saw films from an early age at the Rex Cinema. He talks about cinema. He was a film critic, which you again talk about. And he talks about how he writes, that famous phrase about, I write with the eye of a cine camera rather than a painter. And I just wondered, in terms of writing the biography, how did you feel? How deep did you feel the influence of cinema was upon him in terms of his literary career and his trajectory?
I felt it was very strong. I mean, he agrees or asserts that it is. And when you look at his work, people other than myself, Evelyn Waugh thought very much that this is a cinematic procedure, zooming in, zooming out. He's unlike Dickens, I think. If you think of the way Dickens will compose a place at enormous length, there's something much more of a in any event of a camera shot.
Yes.
Quite quickly,
and kind of editing of that. Yes, yeah.
And so too with dialogue, that the dialogue is very idiomatic at times. He mentioned having an influence from Hemingway, which wouldn't be a cinematic influence, but even so, if you're writing scripts, you really do have to be much more naturalistic in your phrasing, and I think that all of those things combine to underpin his literary craft. Yeah.
And you mentioned Evelyn Waugh, because one of the things another thing I really like about your biography is the way in which you do refer to and describe his literary relationships. He's very much a man, and I'm not even sure this exists anymore, but he's very much a man of letters, a man who is he's writing journalism, he's writing articles, he's writing book reviews, he's writing novels, and he's in correspondence, or he's rubbing shoulders with people who were from an early age. When you talk about him meeting people when he was very young at Oxford, and forming lifelong friendships with people like Evelyn Waugh. And I say that's one of the things I really like about the book. And I'm just wondering how much, as he went on as a writer, because he obviously got inspiration from all the places he visited, but how much was that literary interaction an influence on the way in which his literary career and his writing evolved?
He was, on the one hand, there was something rather shy about him, but on the other hand, that didn't seem to hold him back from extensive involvement with lots of writers. And we can, Elizabeth Bowen, R.K. Narayan. I always wonder if I mispronounce it. Maybe it's Narayan, I should be saying. We can make quite a long list of authors with whom he had important personal relationships. But also, he was a very active editor too. That he was poring over people's works, like Mervyn Peake. He burrowed into Mervyn Peake's work as a publisher, and so he was very conscious of what other writers were doing, and his reading tended to be quite international. He knew what was being written in Africa, in South America, in Asia, and he claimed that Shusaku Endo's silence was far better than his own The Power and the Glory, and which is a very modest thing to say, but then again, it's a very great novel. For those who, I'm sure everyone has probably seen the Scorsese film of it.
Not as many as you'd think, but I think it probably did trigger, people to pick up that book for the first time because of Scorsese's exposure to it. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, so there is an international quality to him. One of the things I think that his contact with other writers tended to do was to globalize his writing. That it always interested me that he never wrote about Oxford, and it's I think he wrote a radio play or something, and wrote about it in his memoir and things like that, but never a set piece novel of the Brideshead Revisited sort, or even a satire. And when he writes about London, he's probably at his best when it's being bombed.
End of the affair. And
so the search for, I guess, what people call Greenland, that ruinous landscape where the human heart is so accessible and exposed, required connections abroad and an awareness of what was happening in places where he wasn't at home. And again, I think that while on the one hand we can attribute that to travel, I think we should also attribute it partly to very broad reading and conversation with very fine international writers.
And on that, I've got this sort of couple more questions before we wrap up. But one question isn't, because we're touching on it today and separately, and I'm chatting about it separately as well. But his relationship with John Le Carré, I think that came originally because actually Greene reached out to him to see whether he could get him for the publisher that he was working for, and then they struck up this quite complicated, it seems, acquaintance. I know you supplied letters to the Adam Siskin biography because you're thanked in that book for giving Adam some of the letters, the correspondence between Greene and Le Carré. And I just wondered how you would characterize that relationship.
And actually, I must say that Adam helped me, so it's not a one-way street because he's an immensely learned man.
It's a very good book, yeah. Another good biography.
Yeah. So early days, Greene thought that the spy that came in from the cold was there's still an endorsement on the back of that volume, the best spy story ever written, or words to that effect. Cornwell, or John Le Carré, really venerated Greene's writing. And for example, there's a letter out there in which he's quite furious about a review Kingsley Amis wrote of the Comedians in 1966.
Yeah,
and
I've read that letter.
Yeah, you know it. And he felt very strongly about that. And then, of course, 1968 or thereabouts, Greene is parading his somewhat, I have to say, perverse allegiance to Kim Philby. And Cornwell, who worked with MI5 and MI6, and MI5, as people know, he had to identify subversion. And, Philby was a subversive, and a lot of people died. And if we just take the objective position that with all its horrible flaws, liberal democracy is better than Stalinist, communism, then at that point, Philby was decidedly in the wrong. It wasn't simply a matter of being committed to a cause. And they had a set to in the press. And it never really came back together. Though I will tell you a funny story. To my mind, it's more poignant than funny. I went to visit Cornwell at his home in Cornwall.
Yes.
And we weren't clicking. The interview is going nowhere. I'm not an accomplished interviewer. I even forgot to turn on my recording device. And he was saying, "Aren't you going to write anything down?" No. It was getting quite embarrassing. He's slapping me around in the conversation, right? And I thought, okay, well, I'll just let him go because he is who he is, and maybe he'll say something I can use. And then we got to a certain point. I reached in my pocket and I gave him a letter. Said, "Do you know this?" A letter from Kim Philby to Graham Greene, eviscerating the honorable schoolboy. And the conversation changed like that. This touched a very, very raw nerve. That why was his idol, almost, Graham Greene, who said in his time carried the torch of British literature almost alone. That's a very big statement to make.
It's a very big statement.
So I guess we can put him down as undecided. That he became very pained and quiet, and actually a much easier person to interview, a much more forthcoming, and what got me was that he very much regretted the coldness that came between him and Greene. They exchanged letters, sure they did, and they were on at least polite terms. But I think he wanted something more. That this was someone to whose work he was devoted, and something came between them.
And on that, I mean, I had the pleasure actually in Noir and Festive because obviously John Le Carré in 2001 received the Raymond Chandler Award, the same award that Greene
wonderful!
got.
I didn't know that.
So he received the same award and visited Courmayeur, and I also interviewed him on stage in London, and actually it's interesting. I'm very interested in your conversation with him, because when we got on to Greene, it was the only thing he had an outburst on stage about Philby, and then he literally said, and this is the point I wanted you to pick up on, really, because you've studied so much the politics of Greene and his political engagement in these different places. He said, well, if I'm being charitable, Adrian, something like this, if I'm being charitable, I'd say that Graham was extremely naive politically, and certainly extremely naive about Kim Philby. And that was what I recall of that conversation. And I wanted to bring it back to what we started with, really, and you talking about exploring the political dimensions of Greene, because later in his life as well, he had that whole thing about Catholics and communists and Catholics for communism and being involved in those guys. In terms of his politics as a person, but as a writer, do you think he was politically naive? Do you how sophisticated was he in terms of his understanding of the politics that he constantly confronted by going to these extreme places and writing about them?
Well, as you're speaking there, I think I would agree that at times he was very penetrating. Like when he went to Batista's Cuba, he saw what was happening. But on the other hand, like a thing in the news right now points to an error of judgment of Graham Greene. In Nicaragua, right now, oh my God, I'm having a blank here. The regime is Murillo, and how can I forgot her husband's name?
Yeah, but yes, the current regime, yes.
Yeah, that he supported that element in the Sandinista movement, which proved to be authoritarian and anti-democratic, and is when at the time he did have the choice. If you recall, a person called Violeta Chamorro, whose name again I'm mispronouncing, ran and won the presidency, and he was disappointed in that. He didn't like that at all, when in fact she represented a democratic strand in Nicaragua, and he plumped for the much more firm anti-American line. And I think that was a significant mistake. Daniel Ortega is the name that I speak of poor Norman Sherry's decline. I'm 60 years old and I've forgotten everything. And
I think your powers of recall are admirable.
Daniel Ortega is generally regarded as really a dictator, and he's behaving appallingly in that country, and he is the rump end of a movement Greene supported, and Greene personally supported Daniel Ortega, introduced him at Westminster in a speech, did all sorts of things, and he didn't see that coming. I think Greene's reaction to Kim Philby is another example of that, and I think there is an element in that which I didn't cover quite as strongly in my book as I ought to have, and it goes like this. David Cornwell describes in The Pigeon Tunnel, his memoir, about sitting down for coffee with a lawyer in MI5 who believes that Greene must be prosecuted over our man in Havana.
In Havana, that's right. Yes. Interesting. In that early part of Le Carré's career, he kind of helps Greene.
And so there is a question of Greene being prosecuted over that book, and MI6 says no. MI5, the enforcers, are enthusiastic for this, it doesn't happen. And the thing that didn't occur to me till after the book was written, that could possibly explain a great deal. Because when Philby defected, and I don't know the timing of this, but he was interviewed by MI5 and was found to be not a guilty party, but he was a very unhelpful witness. I think he was telling them to go to hell. That you give me a hard time, I'm not doing your work for you. And then going forward, there's something perverse about Greene's support of Kim Philby. But I will say on the flip side of that, something that Cornwell remarked on, that sometimes Greene's behavior with known double agents may have been sanctioned to keep a door open in case someone wanted to disclose something. We just don't know about that. That is one side possibility. But for now, I take the point of view that it was a very unreasonable thing for Greene to support Kim Philby as simply a person committed to an idea, and I think that caused a lot of harm.
Yes, and obviously Le Carré, who also had his cover blown by Philby, had another personal, piece of grit in that pearl, that skin in the game as to why. But moving away from the politics and Philby, I want to come back to what we're talking about generally before in terms of literature, but legacy. Obviously, we're having a conversation here. You've written this fantastic new biography. And I think we come from the same place of being huge admirers of Greene as a writer, as a creative artist. But I was fascinated to read the review of your book by actually the most recent recipient of the Raymond Chandler Award, the recipient earlier this year, no less than John Banville, who wrote a very nice review of your book and very positive review of your book. But I was really fascinated to read John's, and it wasn't even damning with faint praise. He very supportive of your book. He's very not supportive of Graham Greene being of the top rank of world novelists. Now, again, apart from him being branded a Catholic novelist, Greene, another moniker of Greene's, apart from carrying the torch of English literature, was the greatest novelist never to have won the Nobel Prize. And I'm just fascinated that a writer of the stature of John Banville writing a very positive review of your biography would be basically saying, well, actually, most of Greene's work is nowhere near as good as people say it is, and a lot of it's second rate, and he doesn't deserve to be in the first rank of novelists. And I just wondered what your reaction to that was from such a distinguished Irish novelist, and where you think, having done all this work, where you think Greene's legacy is. We talked about Catholicism and that difficulty of interpretation, but I'm intrigued to I know, drawing lists and top tens and pantheons is somewhat spurious, but in the pantheon, where do you think it is, particularly when you've got somebody as trenchant as John Banville, as highly respected a creative artist himself, saying, well, Greene's not really that good?
As you see, I have a bit of a bias here in the sense that he was so nice to me in the review. That you know how it is when you're waiting for reviews to come in, and this one likes it, that one doesn't want, this one loves it, this one hates this one. When John Banville's review came in, I felt it was okay. I had, as the phrase goes, gotten away with it. And,
dodged a bullet or whatever.
Yeah. And so in a way, all I saw in that review was that he was nice to me. But when I look at, then I read some of the correspondence about it and went back to it and considered it and realized that he doesn't actually have that high regard for Graham Greene, which is fine. Like if you think that great authors often don't share the common view. I do believe that the great majority of writers would say that Greene is a very substantial figure. A person who I really like and admire is Nicholas Shakespeare.
Hmm.
And Nicholas, we were just talking one day because in his role for so many years, the literary editor at the Telegraph, I believe that's what the position was called, he got a real feel for what was going on out in the book world, the kind of thing that I could never have because I'm just simply not that day to day. You know, it'd be years after a book is a big hit that it falls into my hand.
Right.
And he said that his sense of the authors whose reputation, not whose merit, but whose reputation was hanging about in that generation, it's Greene and Waugh. Great writers, of course. You know, if you think when did someone last read a book or speak about Patrick Hamilton?
That's a very interesting point. You know, it's one of those things that seems it was triggered a few years ago when there was a BBC television series of 20,000 Streets, and that sort of people rediscovered Hamilton, and then that series was on, and then he sort of disappeared again. You know.
Yeah. So, and again, this is quantitative and very loosely so. In getting ready to write the biography, one of the things I did was did searches on newspapers for how often he was referred to, and the number of references in the Guardian was staggering. In one period, it was like a reference a day for a year, and but at the same time, E.M. Forster had 3 references. And that to me was startling because, you know, E.M. Forster's a good writer.
Yeah.
What's this about? So, in a way, in terms of the formation of the canon, I do believe that Greene has a place if there's going to be a canon that matters. I think John Banville is such a learned man and such a sensitive stylist and craftsman that if he would do things very differently than Graham Greene did, I respect that. And I think, you know, I would just say that he's entitled to that view, and I honor it. I see it very differently, and I think the majority of readers do.
And in terms of the majority of readers, and I would obviously, I feel exactly the same about John Banville and his work, and I'm a huge admirer of his work, but I completely disagree with him about Graham Greene. But in terms of what, you know, because a lot of people watching this won't have read your biography yet, but hopefully they'll be encouraged to rush out and buy it either in English or Italian following this interview, and I heartily encourage everyone to do so. Is what would you, in a sense, if you can encapsulate, what would you like people to take from the view you've given us of Graham Greene's world, his personality, his career? What would you like to think that people will get out of the book? That you know that you've spent so much painstaking time giving us.
I think that as we look back on the 20th century, in which, well, for me, most of my life was lived there, and it's still very close to us. That here was a person who quintessentially embodied or encountered much of what our species was. You know, he saw us at our weakest. He was himself, you know, in some ways a disastrous man. But you know, if there's a line at the end of one of the collections of essays of Steele and the 18th century essayist Steele, and he says that my life has been at best pardonable. And so that in one way, we don't look to Graham Greene for sanctity or morality, but what we may look to him is a certain level of perception and vision and and understanding. We don't have to agree with him. In fact, I disagree with him on lots of things. We've been talking here,
Yeah.
the Philby, Ortega, and some other things where he. But if you take that many chances on knowing the world, you're going to be wrong a certain percentage of the time. And I think that if we look to Graham Greene, we have someone who in his skin lived the time in a way that few people did. And as a writer, he had the means to articulate it.
Well, I think that's a beautiful kind of way to kind of summarize and end this conversation for Noir Infest. I really appreciate your time, your erudition, your articulation of some of the themes of your wonderful biography, Richard. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you today, and I'm sure it's going to hasten lots of people who haven't either read your book or haven't read Greene recently to go out and hopefully discover or rediscover him. So thank you very much for being our guest at Noir Infest. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
And I am so honored to be involved here, and I absolutely am going to make my way to the Noir Festival when it's in person again, and I'm just going to enjoy all the beautiful things, the talks and the interviews, and I'm very, very grateful to be here today and for your amazing questions. Thank you.